The day you became a pirate. You wake up because somebody is shouting. Not your name. Not even a word you recognize. Just a long, angry noise from somewhere above you. And then the sound of wood cracking. For a few seconds you lie still and let the ship do the moving for you. It isn't gentle. The floor rolls one way, hangs there a beat too long, then rolls back like it's forgotten which direction it's supposed to be going. You open your eyes. It's dark, the air thick with wet rope and old wood and sweat, and something sour you'd rather not identify. Then the cannon fires, and your whole body flinches with it. Dust sifts down from the ceiling. Somebody nearby starts praying. Somebody else laughs, which is somehow worse. Bare feet slap across the boards overhead, and a voice up there is screaming for everyone to get on deck. You sit up. Your heart is going too fast to think clearly. You don't know what's happening. You just know you're not supposed to be here. Hours earlier you were an ordinary sailor, and already that feels like a story about someone else. You'd been aboard a merchant ship crossing the Caribbean with cargo that was valuable enough to matter and boring enough that nobody would ever write a song about it. Sugar, molasses, cloth, food. A few crates of manufactured goods you never bothered asking about. That had been your whole life for weeks. Rope you pulled, decks you cleaned, barrels that seemed to get heavier every time somebody handed you one. You weren't famous. You weren't especially brave. You definitely weren't looking to become a pirate. You just wanted to finish the voyage and go home. And at the time that had seemed like a perfectly reasonable plan. The lookout spotted the other ship first. Nobody worried about it right away. Ships crossed the horizon constantly, merchants and fishing boats and the occasional Navy vessel, and most of them just passed by. This one didn't pass by. It kept coming, and it was coming fast. The captain went up with his telescope. Looked, lowered it, looked again. He didn't say anything. And that silence told you more than any order could have. Then the orders started anyway. Lower the sail, secure the cargo, move those barrels, check the weapons, and you were pulled into securing cargo without anyone bothering to explain why, until the other ship raised its flag. Dark color, unmistakable shape. Someone beside you said the word out loud, quietly, like saying it might make it more true. Pirates. You'd grown up hearing about pirates the way you'd grown up hearing about ghosts. Real enough to be interesting, distant enough to never actually matter. Then the first cannonball hit, and the whole idea stopped being distant. The sound was like the world tearing. Wood exploded inward. A man went down. A loose barrel rolled the length of the deck, knocking men off their feet. And somewhere in the smoke someone was screaming instructions nobody could follow. You grabbed the nearest rope because you needed something to hold on to, not because you had a plan. There wasn't time for one. The ships closed, then collided, hooks biting into the railing, and the pirates came across with pistols and cutlasses and, in one man's case, an axe that seemed built for something other than reasonable use. It lasted a few minutes. It felt much longer. Your captain tried to hold the crew together and couldn't, and when it was over your ship belonged to somebody else and you, somehow, were still standing on it. You thought that meant you were safe. It didn't mean that at all. A pirate walked over and looked you up and down, your clothes, your hands, your face, in that order, like he was reading something. You know how to sail? You nodded. He smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. Good. That one word rearranged your entire future. You weren't killed, and you weren't let go. You were taken, along with a handful of other captured sailors, and marched aboard a ship that looked nothing like you'd pictured. Smaller than yours. Older. Its hull was scarred with the kind of damage that comes from years of storms and fights and repairs done in a hurry. And the sails had been patched so many times you couldn't guess what color they'd started out. You'd imagine pirate ships as something fearsome. This one just looked exhausted, in the way a person looks exhausted after too many bad years in a row. Somebody handed you a shirt. It was filthy, and you said as much, and got told you'd need it anyway. Fair enough? Except then he looked at the shirt you were already wearing and simply took it, and walked off wearing it himself like that was a normal transaction between two grown men. You watched him disappear into the crowd of the crew and understood, in that moment, the first real rule of your new life. Nothing here was really yours anymore. Not your clothes, not your food, not your time. Your future belonged to whoever had decided you were useful. That evening you were the life you were never supposed to get used to. By the time another ship appeared on the horizon, you'd stopped feeling completely new, and that bothered you more than you wanted to admit. You knew the vessel now, the loose board near the mast that clicked under your heel, the rope that left a red welt across your palm if you pulled it without wrapping it properly first, which barrel the cook guarded like it held gold instead of flour. You knew which hammock stayed driest when rain came through the open sections of deck. You even knew where the rats liked to hide, which was a piece of knowledge you'd have happily traded back. You'd picked up a nickname too, and the story of how was not flattering. It happened during a storm, hauling a bucket of water across the deck, when the ship rolled hard enough to take your feet out from under you. The bucket went flying and emptied itself squarely onto the captain. Nobody moved for a second. You sat there on the wet boards, hair plastered across your face, watching water drip off the end of his beard, and then someone near the mast lost it laughing. The captain muttered something you were glad not to fully catch, and a sailor near the rail called you Bucket. It stuck because nobody could be bothered inventing anything better. You stopped correcting them after the third or fourth try. Little humiliations stopped mattering after enough time at sea. Falling over wasn't embarrassing when the whole crew had fallen over at some point. Getting sick over the railing didn't earn you anything worse than a few tired jokes when half the men had done the same thing during the last storm. Waking up with someone's foot in your back was just what sleeping on this ship meant. You noticed, too, that the men who laughed loudest at somebody else's misery had usually gone through the same thing themselves not long before. Your body was changing in ways you only noticed in pieces. Your palms toughened until ropes stopped cutting into them so easily. Your shoulders got stronger from work you'd never chosen. The back of your neck stayed permanently dark from the sun, and your clothes had settled into a smell that no amount of rinsing seemed to touch. Salt and smoke and old wood, worked so deep into the fabric it felt permanent. You'd given up asking when you'd get a proper bath, mostly because asking made the older sailors laugh at you. Rain was the closest thing anyone had to one. When a heavy downpour hit, men stripped off their shirts and stood on deck letting it run over them, scrubbing at their arms and necks like it actually mattered. You tried it once and found the rainwater colder than the sea itself. A sailor beside you worked both hands through his hair and told you, dead serious, that he hadn't felt this clean in 6 months. Then the sun came back out, and everyone went back to work like nothing had happened. Food became the real way you kept track of time. Fresh supplies never lasted, so most meals came out of a barrel one way or another. Salted meat tough enough that you could chew for a full minute and still feel like you hadn't eaten anything. Hardtack you'd learned to soak first, partly to save your teeth, and partly because it sometimes had tiny residents who seemed to think they had a claim on it. You stopped asking what was in the stew a while back. That was a rule you kept for yourself. The cook had a face like a hatchet and one eyebrow that never quite matched the other, and he was missing part of his left ear, though the story of how changed depending on the day you asked him. A shark once, a cannon another time, a jealous husband, a falling anchor. You eventually decided the truth probably wasn't as good as any of the versions he gave you, and he seemed almost proud once you stopped pressing him for the real one. Water was rationed carefully enough that you learned to drink slow even when you were dying of thirst, because the barrel had to outlast your impatience whether you liked it or not. The first time you finished your ration too fast, you stood there holding the empty cup feeling like an idiot while the man next to you watched with something close to pity. "You'll learn," he said, and he wasn't wrong. One afternoon, a sailor got caught taking extra biscuits from the stores, and the quartermaster hauled him out on deck to explain himself. The man hesitated, glanced toward the barrels, and admitted he'd been hungry. Nobody laughed at that, which told you something. You realized, watching it play out, that everyone on that ship was hungry in some low, constant way, not starving, but never quite forgetting how much food was left and how long it needed to stretch. On land, wasting half a loaf of bread cost you nothing. Out here, one man's extra portion was another man's missing meal, and there wasn't a shop around the corner to fix the mistake. That was the logic behind most of the rules aboard, once you actually paid attention. They weren't key. When the sea stops feeling like freedom, the naval ship kept coming, and for a few seconds nobody on your deck seemed willing to say what everyone was clearly thinking. It was bigger than your vessel by a wide margin, taller rig, more guns down the side than your own ship could pretend to match. Tiny figures moved across its deck getting ready, and even from this distance there was something unnerving about how they worked. No shouting, no confusion, nothing like the scramble your own crew usually managed. Just men doing something they'd clearly done 100 times before. The captain turned and told everyone to get ready. Nobody asked what happened if you lost. There wasn't much point asking a question everyone already knew the answer to. You wrapped your hand around a rope that felt strange to call familiar now, though it was the same rough fiber that had torn your palms raw back when you first came aboard now just sat there, natural, like it belonged. Around you men checked pistols and tightened belts and lashed down anything loose enough to turn dangerous once the ship started taking hits. The quartermaster walked past with a face gone flat and calm in a way you'd learned meant the opposite of relaxed. That was the look men got once there was nothing left to pretend about. The first cannon fired before the naval ship was even close enough to make out faces. It landed short and threw up a wall of seawater, and a few men laughed at how far off it was, though nobody actually relaxed. The second shot came nearer, close enough that the impact rocked the whole ship and sent a wooden cup skating across the deck. The third one hit. Wood tore open near the bow, and a sailor went down on his knees clutching his arm, and you froze for half a second before your body caught up with everyone else's, already moving toward him. Someone shouted for cloth. Another man dragged him behind the mast while you pressed fabric against the wound, your hands slick almost immediately. The man looked up at you and tried to laugh through it. "Don't look so worried, Bucket." You almost managed to laugh back before the next cannon went off and cut it short. The pirate ship swung hard, trying to bring its own guns to bear, smoke rolling across the deck and stinging your eyes. The smell was familiar now, which bothered you more than the smell itself did. There had been a time when gunpowder meant pure terror, and now your body seemed to recognize it before your mind caught up. You were getting used to things you'd once assumed no one could get used to. Another shot tore through the rigging overhead. A rope snapped and whipped down across the deck hard enough to knock a man sideways, and you ducked without thinking, pieces of frayed rope falling around you while your ears rang from the noise. The captain was shouting for everyone to hold position, and you did, and the two ships kept closing, closer, close enough now that you could see actual faces on the other deck. A man with a red scarf around his neck. Another with a beard trimmed unevenly, like he'd done it himself with a knife and no mirror. One sailor by a cannon was chewing something, jaw working steadily, apparently unbothered by the fact that he was about to fire on you. That detail stuck with you longer than anything else that day. You'd expected the enemy to look different somehow. They didn't. They looked tired. They looked like anyone. Then the ships passed each other and the moment was gone, swallowed by more shouting and more work. Pull this rope. Secure that line. Keep your feet under you. You didn't have time to think about dying. You just had the next thing that needed doing, and then the thing after that. Eventually, the naval ship started falling behind, and you'd gotten away, though nobody celebrated right away. Everyone waited, watching it shrink into the distance, before the tension actually started leaving the deck. Then the laughing started. A sailor sat down by a barrel and found his hands were shaking. Another leaned against the mast with his eyes shut. Someone went looking for the cook and demanded rum loud enough to be heard over everyone else. You looked down at your own hands. They were shaking too. You hadn't even noticed. That night the crew patched what they could. Rigging replaced, a section of deck repaired, the wounded sailor's arm wrapped tight, while the ship's surgeon quietly mentioned he might lose some movement in it if the wound turned bad. Nobody talked about that part much. They just kept working, the way people do when talking about the bad outcome doesn't change anything. You stayed up later than usual after that. The sea had gone calm again, and it felt almost unfair how peaceful it could look after what had just happened. Sitting near the stern, watching moonlight move across the water, you realized you now knew what every creak of the ship meant. That one's a loose board, that one's a rope shifting, that on.